the Duke of Hollowmere introduced his mistress as the new Duchess before 200 assembled guests, and his wife, sitting where she had always sat, at the small round table nearest the door where the overlooked are permitted to sit, did not spill her wine. She had grown 3 years practiced at not spilling things. Wren Ashdown set her glass down with the particular care of a woman who has trained her hands to disagree with her heart, and she watched her husband walk the length of the ballroom with a stranger's gloved fingers resting on his sleeve, and she smiled. She did not yet know what that smile would cost her, or buy her. Had she known the whole of it that night, she would have smiled all the same. The stranger on Gareth's arm was young and lovely in the practiced way of women who have been told since girlhood that loveliness is a profession, and the room's 200 throats made the particular silence that precedes gossip, a held breath with 100 tongues behind it. Somewhere near the punch table, Mr. Roland Vane, the Duke's cousin and the estate's man of business, was smiling too, and his smile did not reach nearly so far as hers. Wren noticed that. She noticed nearly everything. It was the one luxury poverty and plainness had left her. The plain fact that no one troubles to watch a woman they have already decided not to see, which leaves that woman a great deal of time to watch everyone else. A wren sings loudest when the frost is hardest, her father used to say, because it is the only season anyone troubles to notice her at all. Wren had never much cared for the joke about her name until tonight, when she understood, watching her husband's face, that the frost had arrived early this year, and that she meant to sing anyway. In 4 days, the trustees would gather at Hollowmere Court for the Michaelmas audit, as they gathered every year, to review the estate's accounts and to confirm, as a matter of dull and necessary custom, the settlements attached to the Duke's marriage. This year the confirmation would not be dull. This year it would decide whether Wren Ashdown remained a duchess at all, or became merely a woman who had once, briefly and by some clerk's error, been mistaken for one. Gareth reached the center of the floor with his stranger still on his arm, and he lifted his voice, and it did not shake. Because Gareth Ashdown's voice had not shaken in the 3 years Wren had known him, not once, not even the night his brother's horse came back to the stable without his brother. "My friends," he said, "allow me to present the future of this house." He did not look toward the small table by the door. Wren understood, even then, even before she understood anything else, that the not looking was its own kind of message, addressed to her alone, in a language only the overlooked are fluent in. She raised her glass to her lips and drank, and the wine tasted of nothing at all, which she would remember afterward. As the strangest part of the whole terrible evening, that betrayal, when it finally came for her, tasted of nothing. She did not go to him that night. She let 200 guests exhaust their scandal and their carriages and their candles, and she climbed the west stair to her own rooms and sat by her own cold grate, and it was near 2 in the morning when the knock came, soft at her door. Mrs. Colquitt did not wait to be answered before she let herself in, because 30 years of service had taught her precisely which doors that rule applied to, and this was not one of them. "You'll want a fire," the housekeeper said, already crouched at the grate with the practical brutality of a woman who does not believe grief excuses cold hands. "And you'll want to hear it from him, and not from me, though God knows I have opinions. I imagine you do. I imagine you'd rather hear his reasons than my opinions. I would rather," Wren said, "hear both, and in that order." Mrs. Colquitt struck the flint and did not look round. "He is a man who has never in his life explained himself to anyone, Your Grace, including, I would wager, himself. That is not fondness talking. That is 30 years of watching him. It sounded a great deal like fondness. It is both. A woman can hold two true things in one hand. When the fire caught, the housekeeper rose, wiped her palms on her apron in one brisk motion that Ren had come to recognize the way one recognizes a signature, and said, before she let herself out, "Go to him. Make him say the thing plainly, whatever it costs him." Men like him would rather lose a duchy than say a true sentence before breakfast. It was, Ren thought, watching the door close, very good advice, and she took it. She found him in the estate office, not the study, which told her something before she said a word, because the study was where a duke received visitors, and the office was where he kept the ledgers, and Gareth Ashdown had gone to the room that held the truth of things, rather than the room built for performing them. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked, if anything, as though he had been waiting, the way a man waits outside a door he has locked himself. "You did not spill your wine," he said. "I have had 3 years of practice not spilling it in front of you. That is not an answer to the question I have not yet asked. You have not asked a question. You have made an announcement before 200 witnesses that I no longer exist in the capacity I believed I occupied. I am not certain what question follows that, except perhaps whether I ought to begin packing tonight or wait for the morning coach." He set down his pen. His hands, she noticed, as she had noticed since the first week of her marriage, were not a duke's hands. They were roughened at the knuckle and calloused along the first 2 fingers from a decade of holding his own reins and mending his own fences rather than watching men do it for him, and she had always found something unbearably honest in that. In a man who could have had every task done for him and had chosen, instead, to keep his hands truthful even when nothing else about his life allowed him to be. "You will not pack," he said. "You will stay in this house exactly as you have stayed in it, and you will let the world believe whatever it likes for 4 days, and on the 5th you will have your answer in full." That is not an explanation. That is an instruction. It is the only one I can give you tonight. Then give me a worse one, and I will accept it, because I have found I can accept nearly anything except silence dressed up as kindness. Something crossed his face then, quick, gone before she could read it fully, though she had made a study of his face the way other women study fashion plates. "I am protecting you," he said, "from a thing I am not yet permitted to name, by a woman on whose door I am not yet permitted to knock. I know that is not enough. It is what I have. You married me for accounts kept honest," Ren said, quietly, because it was the truest thing between them, the sentence he had said to her the week before their wedding and which she had carried since like a coin in a pocket, worn smooth from handling. "I will not ask you to love me. I will only ask you to keep the accounts honest and let the rest come as it will. You did not marry me for this, for 200 people watching you replace me with a stranger and calling it my education. No," he said, and for the first time that night his composure had a crack in it thin as a hairline in old glass. "I did not marry you for this. I did not know, when I married you, that it would come to this. I am asking you to trust a man who has given you very little reason to, for 4 more days, because the alternative is a great deal worse than a ballroom full of whispers." She studied him a long moment, the way she studied a column of figures that would not balance, hunting the error rather than the innocent numbers around it. 4 days, she said finally. "I will give you 4 days, Gareth, because you have never once lied to me outright, only declined to speak, which I have decided, tonight, to consider a virtue rather than call it a fault. But I will not spend them idle. I did not imagine you would." "Good," she said, "because I intend to open my father's old ledgers tonight, and I would take it as a kindness if you did not ask me why until I have finished." Her father, Josiah Fairweather, had kept books for half the merchants and 2 of the lesser gentry of Fenbridge until the debt that ended him, a debt Wren had spent 3 years quietly certain he had not truly owed, though certainty and proof are different currencies, and she had never possessed enough of the second to spend. He had died the year before her marriage, in the small brick house behind the Chandlers, with his ledgers stacked beside his bed like a man keeping his own accounts against a final reckoning, and it was that debt, and its sudden and inexplicable transfer to the Ashdown Estates books, that had first brought Gareth's father to the Fairweather door with an offer that was never called a bargain. Aloud, though everyone in the room had understood it as one. Marry the daughter, clear the debt, keep the scandal quiet. Gareth had been 23 and freshly the Duke, his own father dead a month, his brother dead the year before that, and he had made the offer himself, in the end, with a plainness Wren had never forgotten. Ink does not lie, even when men do, her father used to tell her, hunched over his columns by lamplight, and she had grown up believing it the way other children grow up believing in Sunday sermons, without proof, purely on the strength of love for the man saying it. 3 years married to a duke who kept his own accounts, and rarely his own confidences, had not shaken that belief. If anything, it had sharpened it into something closer to a doctrine, and it was that doctrine she carried up to the box room that night, past midnight, with a candle in one hand and her father's smallest ledger in the other, the one bound in brass cornered calf that she had never quite had reason to open past the first ordinary pages, and would not have reason to open fully for 2 days yet, though she did not know that as she climbed the stair. She only knew that 4 days had been offered her, and that a woman who is never looked at learns, if she is clever, to look at everything else, and that she did not intend to waste a single hour of the 4 days doing anything less. Mr. Roland Vane called upon her the following afternoon, and he called with flowers, which ought to have warned her, since Roland Vane had never in 3 years brought her so much as a compliment, unaccompanied by a request. He was a handsome man in the smooth, poured way of Riverstones, worn featureless by long patience, and his voice when he was at his gentlest was the voice Wren had learned, slowly and at some cost, to fear most in the whole household, because the loudest men in that house had never frightened her at all. "You bear it very well," he said, setting the flowers on the table between them as though laying down a hand of cards. "I have had practice. You have had a husband who does not know how to spare a woman's feelings in public, which is a different education entirely, and a crueler one. I have come to offer you something kinder than his silence. Kindness from you, Mr. Vane, generally arrives with a figure attached." He smiled, and did not deny it. £600 a year, and the dower cottage at Little Marrow, and no one need trouble you with lawyers or trustees or the unpleasantness of a public inquiry into a marriage that was never, if we are honest, more than a transaction to begin with. You take the money. You take the quiet. You spare yourself 4 days from now standing before Sir Aldous Penn and the whole board of trustees while they decide, in front of the county, whether you were ever truly a duchess at all. That is a great deal of certainty for a man who claims no part in the deciding. I claim only sympathy, Your Grace. I have always had a great deal of it for you. He rose to go, and paused at the door, and said, almost as an afterthought, in the mild voice of a man remarking on weather, "Your father kept beautiful books, you know. I saw them once, years ago, when the Fenbridge debt was first assigned to this estate. Such a careful hand. It is a pity a hand so careful should have made so costly an error." He was gone before she could ask him which error he meant, and it was only much later, turning the flowers over in her hands and finding nothing beneath their ribbon but flowers, that Wren understood he had not meant to answer the question. He had meant only to plant it, the way a careful gardener plants a seed he intends to return for in a season of his own choosing. And she filed the sentence away exactly where she filed every unbalanced column she had ever met, in the patient part of her mind that did not forget. The nights that followed took on a shape Wren would afterward think of, without quite meaning to, as the happiest of her marriage, though nothing about them ought by rights to have been happy at all. Gareth kept his own hours over the estate books now, later than any duke needed to, and on the second night she found him there past midnight, with ink on his knuckles and his cravat long since abandoned over the back of a chair. And instead of retreating to her own cold room, she drew up the second chair, the one that had sat unused at that desk for 3 years, and reached for the ledger nearest her hand. "You needn't," he said. "I know I needn't. I am aware, Gareth, of a great many things I needn't do. I have simply run out of patience for doing only those." He watched her a moment, and something in his face loosened, the way a man's shoulders loosen when a weight he has carried so long he forgot its shape is finally shared. "The Fenbridge accounts don't balance," he said. "They have not balanced, I think, for a decade, and I have only just begun to see the shape of where the difference goes. To Mr. Vane, I cannot prove that yet." "No," she agreed, drawing a column of her own father's old figures beside his, "but I can help you look. And looking is a thing I am considerably better at than most people credit me for." They worked in near silence for an hour, the kind of silence two competent people share over shared trouble, broken only by the scratch of pens, and once by Wren's dry observation that whoever had falsified the timber accounts for Michaelmas of the year before last had at least the courtesy to falsify them in a straight line, which was more consideration than most forgers showed a woman's eyesight. Gareth laughed. It surprised them both. She saw it surprise him, saw the sound catch him almost off guard, a real laugh, low and short and entirely undefended, the first she had heard from him in 3 years of marriage, and she marked it the way she marked every unbalanced column, with the private, thorough attention of a woman deciding this mattered, and meant to remember it. "I did not know you found ink stains amusing," he said. "I find incompetence amusing, Your Grace. Incompetent forgery doubly so. You are the strangest woman I have ever met. You married the strangest woman you ever met for the sake of her father's honest hand at figures. I should think that unsurprising by now." He did not answer that, but he did not look away from her either, and something passed between them that was not yet love, not quite, but was no longer merely arrangement. And Wren went to bed that night, turning it over like a coin, whose true value she had only just begun to guess. It was on the third day, with the audit one sunrise off, that the blow came. And it came not from Vane's mouth, but from his hand, in the form of a letter he laid before the assembled trustees with the particular gentleness of a man laying down a winning card he has waited years to play. The letter bore, or appeared to bear, the signature of Wren's own father, and it stated, "In Josiah Fairweather's careful, familiar hand, that the original Fenbridge debt had been invented, the figures forged from the start, to entrap the old Duke into a marriage settlement neither family could otherwise have justified." Sir Aldous Penn read it aloud in the trustees' chamber with his spectacles low on his nose, and the room's silence afterward was not the silence of scandal, but something colder, the silence of men doing sums in their heads about what such a letter, if true, would cost. "If this is genuine," Sir Aldous said slowly, "the settlement was fraudulent from its foundation, and I am obliged, gentlemen, to suspend the Duchess's standing pending a full examination." Wren sat very still. The very asset she had trusted longest and most simply, her father's honest hand, her whole inheritance of ink and integrity, had just been turned, in one gentle letter, into the weapon that might undo her. "That signature is a forgery," she said, and her voice did not shake, though she felt the shaking somewhere further down, in a place voices do not reach. "I have read my father's hand across 1,000 pages. This is close. It is not his." "Close," said Vane gently, from across the table, "is precisely the trouble with forgery, is it not, Your Grace? It so rarely announces itself." Sir Aldous folded his spectacles. "Then we shall want more than your word against a document, Your Grace, however sincerely given. The board reconvenes at Michaelmas dawn. Until then, I am afraid, matters stand as they stand." What followed was the ugliest quarrel of Wren's marriage, conducted in low voices behind a closed door, because Gareth would not raise his, and she found, to her own surprise, that she would not either, not even now. "You knew this was coming," she said. "You knew some shape of it. You said protect. You said 4 days. And you let me sit in that room and hear my father called a forger, with no more warning than a locked door and a promise. I did not know the letter existed until this morning. But you knew there would be a letter, or a document, or some manner of blow shaped like this one. You have known for weeks that Vane meant to move against the marriage, and you chose, again, to carry it alone, because that is the only shape of love you seem to know how to offer anyone, Gareth, carrying things alone until they crush you and calling it protection." He did not answer at once, and when he did his voice had gone very quiet, quieter than she had ever heard it. "My brother died because I let him ride out alone into a storm I was too proud to admit, frightened me, and I have spent every year since believing that if I had only told him what I feared, he might have stayed. I do not know how to warn the people I love without believing the warning itself is the thing that kills them." It was, Wren understood, the truest sentence he had ever given her, and she did not know, in that moment, what to do with its weight except set it down gently beside her own anger and let both things be true at once. "Then learn," she said, "because I would rather be frightened beside you than safe and alone in the dark, and I have had 3 years of the second, and I find I am finished with it." She left him with that, not as a punishment, but because some sentences need room to be heard in, and she suspected he needed the room more than she did. It was Mr. Pell, Vane's own clerk, who came to her that same evening with an offer dressed as sympathy, twisting his hat in both hands in the kitchen passage, where servants and duchesses are not supposed to meet but sometimes, in houses under siege, do. "Miss," Vane says, he began, and stopped, and began again. "There is a paper, Your Grace, that would settle the matter quiet. A renunciation, your signature only, and a sum with it, generous, and you'd be spared the dawn tomorrow and whatever the board decides in front of the whole county. And my father's name remains a forger's, forever, in every parish record from here to Fenbridge. It would be quiet, Your Grace, that's worth something. It is worth £600 a year, and my father's grave dishonored in it, Mr. Pell and I find, having weighed both sums with some care, that I cannot afford the second at any price you are able to offer." She watched something flicker in his face, not triumph, not quite shame either, something closer to a man watching a door he had hoped would open quietly close instead, and she thought, filing it away with the rest, that Mr. Pell did not entirely relish the errand he had been sent to run. By the 4th night, Wren had been informed, with the particular gentle firmness Sir Aldous reserved for unpleasant duties, that she was to remove to the dower house at Little Marrow until the board's findings were settled. A courtesy, he called it, though it felt a great deal more like a door closing. Gareth was forbidden, by the trustee's own ruling, from sheltering her further under the main roof while her standing remained in question, a rule that struck them both, in its way, as the cruelest of Vane's small victories, crueler than the letter itself. She sat alone in the dower house's single-lit room that night, with her father's brass-cornered ledger open on her knee, having pored over its ordinary pages a dozen times already and found nothing, when Mrs. Colquitt let herself in without knocking, as was her habit, a lantern in one hand and, tucked beneath her shawl, a second ledger Wren had never seen before, older, its calf binding soft with handling. "Found it in the box room, behind the one you'd already been through," the housekeeper said. "Your father sent it here himself, the year before he died, with a note asking it be kept safe, and never mind why. I never thought to give it you before. Forgive an old woman her forgetting." Wren's hands, opening the cover, were not quite steady, and she noted that fact the way she noted everything, without shame. The end paper at the back was thicker than it ought to have been, glued at a seam too neat for an ordinary binding, and beneath her thumbnail it lifted, just slightly, just enough to show a second layer of paper pressed flat beneath it, covered edge to edge in her father's unmistakable hand. "Ink does not lie, even when men do," he had written once more, at the top of that hidden page, as though he had known, even dying, that someone would someday need reminding. She sat with the ledger in her lap and the lantern guttering, and did not yet know, in that hour, whether what lay beneath that seam would be enough to save her by morning, or whether she had found the truth only a night too late to matter. She had until dawn to find out, and she did not intend to spend a single minute of it sleeping. She spent it instead at the small table with Mrs. Colquitt on one side of the lamp, and, arriving near midnight with her cloak still damp from the ride, Miss Cressida Lowell on the other, the very woman who 4 nights before had stood on Gareth's arm and been called the future of the house. "You will want an explanation," Cressida said, before Wren could ask for one, "and I mean to give you the whole of it, because I have played my part, and I find I have no taste left for playing it a moment longer than I must. You were never his mistress. I was never anything of the kind. I am an old friend of his sister's, your grace, and an actress besides, which he remembered when he needed a woman willing to stand in a ballroom and be hated by 200 strangers for a fortnight, in service of drawing a patient man out of his patience. Misser, Vane believed, the moment he saw me on Gareth's arm, that the marriage was already as good as dissolved. And a man who believes himself already victorious grows careless in exactly the ways a cautious man does not. Gareth needed him careless. I am sorry it cost you what it cost you. I did not know, until I stood in that ballroom and watched your face not move at all, quite how much that would be. Wren studied her a long moment, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she believed her, and that belief and forgiveness, while different currencies again, were not so very far apart in value after all. "Then let us be careless in return," she said, and turned back to the hidden page. What lay beneath the seam was not a confession, but an account, a full and careful record in her father's own true hand of every figure Roland Vane had falsified across 11 years of Fenbridge ledgers, cross-referenced against a second column in different ink that Josiah Fairweather had clearly copied in secret from documents not his own, documents he must have seen and recognized and understood at terrible personal cost he dared not yet expose. The debt that had ruined him, the debt that had bought Wren's marriage, had never existed at all until Vane invented it to cover a decade of his own quiet theft, and when her father discovered the invention and threatened to speak, Vane had turned the debt itself against him, transferring it to the Fairweather name specifically to silence the one man alive who could read his forgeries for what they were. It was, Wren thought, staring at the page until the letters swam, the cruelest kind of arithmetic, a man's own honesty used as the very rope to hang him with. And there, in the final column, in ink gone brown with age but still unmistakably legible, was a sample of Vane's true signature, copied by her father from an old estate paper years before anyone had thought to falsify anything. Preserved here precisely so that someday, if it were ever needed, an honest hand might be set beside a dishonest one, and the difference read plain in the light. He knew, Wren said quietly. He knew, and he could not prove it in time to save himself, so he built the proof and hid it, and hoped someone cleverer or luckier than he had been would need it one day. "You are both," said Mrs. Colquitt, not unkindly, which I imagine is exactly what he was hoping for. Cressida was already reaching for pen and paper to draft the letter that would reach Sir Aldous before dawn, and outside the Dower House window, though none of them paused to notice it that night, the first wrens of the frost season had begun, faint and startlingly loud for such small birds, to sing. Roland Vane arrived at the Dower House an hour before first light, alone, without his usual smoothness, and Wren understood before he spoke a word that he had somehow learned the ledger survived. "You will want to burn whatever you believe you've found," he said, "before you carry it anywhere a fool could misread it." "I have read it a great many times already, Mr. Vane, and found no way to misread it at all." His hands, she noticed, were not still. It was the first time in 3 years she had seen them anything other than perfectly composed, and she filed that away too, the way she filed everything, understanding it for what it was, not menace but fear, arriving late and unpracticed on a face that had never before needed to know its shape. The board convened at dawn in the long room at Hollowmere Court, trustees and tenants and half the county crowded along the walls, because word of a duchess's disgrace travels faster than any coach, and word of her possible vindication travels faster still. Sir Aldous Penn sat at the head of the table with the disputed letter before him, and Gareth stood, by rule, apart from his wife, though his eyes did not once leave her the whole of the proceeding. "You claim the document accusing your father is a forgery," Sir Aldous said. "I do not claim it," Wren said. "I intend to show it." She laid her father's true ledger on the table, opened to the hidden page, and lifted it to the tall window's light so the whole room could see the second layer of ink beneath the false end paper's seam. "My father copied Mr. Vane's true signature onto this page some 11 years ago, when he first discovered the man had been falsifying the Fenbridge accounts. Here is that true signature. Here, beside it, is the signature on the letter Mr. Vane presented to this board 4 days past, claiming to be my father's hand, confessing a fraud that never occurred. I ask the board to look at both, side by side, in the light, and tell me honestly whether they are written by the same hand at all." The room held its collective breath while Sir Aldous rose, took both papers to the window himself, and held them up together against the gray autumn morning. The difference, once seen, could not be unseen. The false letter's hand strained for a resemblance it did not naturally possess, cramped where the true one flowed. "They are not the same hand," Sir Aldous said, and something in the room's silence changed shape entirely. Wren turned then to Mr. Pell, who stood near the door with his hat in his hands exactly as he had stood in the kitchen passage 4 nights before. "Mr. Pell, you copied that letter, did you not? Not forged it from nothing, but copied it from an older sample of my father's true hand at Mr. Vane's direction." Pell's throat worked once before any sound came out of it. "I did," he said. "God forgive me, I did, and I have not slept a full night since I did it." Vane moved to speak, and it was the first time in 3 years Wren had heard him raise his voice at all, and it did him no good whatsoever, because a man's first raised voice, arriving that late, only proves how long the quiet one had been a performance. "I built this house's accounts for 11 years, while a boy young enough to be my son inherited it by nothing but the accident of blood, he said. And something in his face, for just a moment, was not calculation at all, but old, plain grief. The grief of a man who had spent his whole life keeping someone else's books and calling it justice. Sir Aldous let the silence sit before he spoke again, because some silences do more work than any verdict. The board finds the letter a forgery, the original debt fraudulent from its founding, and the Duchess's standing, and her father's honor fully restored, he said. As to Mr. Vane, he looked, for the first time in the proceeding, toward Gareth. Gareth crossed the room and stood before his cousin, and his voice, when it came, held no triumph in it at all. "You will have an allowance," he said, "and a passage to my aunt's estate in the north, where you will live out your years quietly and never again hold a pen over any ledger belonging to this family. I do this not for your sake. I do it because Fenbridge's tenants have depended on this name for generations, and a public trial would cost them the very stability you claim to have envied me for, and I will not let your fall be paid for out of their pockets. Go, Roland, and be grateful I have chosen mercy over the reckoning you gave my wife's father." Vane did not thank him. He only nodded, once, and something in the nod looked very much like a man setting down a weight he had carried so long it had become indistinguishable from himself. It was Mrs. Colquitt, hours later, who wept first, loudly and without the smallest embarrassment, over a tray of tea no one had asked her to bring, and it was Cressida who laughed at her for it, and then, a moment later, wept too. And it was full evening, the wrens gone quiet in the frost outside, before Gareth found Wren alone in the estate office, where their strangest and truest hours together had always been spent. "I asked you once," he said, "to keep the accounts honest and let the rest come as it will. I did not know, when I said it, what the rest would turn out to be. And now you know. Now I know, and I find I am no longer willing to leave it to chance. I am not asking you to keep anything for me anymore, Wren, not accounts, not silence, not patience with a man who does not know how to warn the people he loves without believing the warning will kill them. I am only asking you to stay. Because you wish it, and for no other reason at all, since every other reason has already been settled without your love ever once being asked to pay for it." She let the silence hold a moment, the way she had learned to let true things breathe before she answered them. "I have been overlooked all my life," she said. "I have simply never once been unseen. I think, Gareth, that is the whole difference between us and every other match arranged in a lawyer's office, and I think I have finally decided I would like to marry you again, properly, for that reason and no other." They were married a second time, quietly, before a bare handful of guests, in the small stone chapel at Fenbridge, with Mrs. Colquitt weeping openly in the second pew and Cressida beside her, laughing through her own tears, and Sir Aldous Penn standing as witness with the particular satisfaction of a man who has seen justice done and found it, for once, sweeter than he expected. Mr. Pell was given his position back on the strict condition of honest ledgers ever after, and kept it faithfully the rest of his working life. Cressida Lowell returned to London and, within the year, to everyone's surprise but her own, married a widowed theater manager who had loved her long before any of this began, and wrote to Wren every Michaelmas thereafter, with news of full houses and a happy, unremarkable life. Roland Vane lived out his years in the north in a quiet the county never troubled to ask after, and it was said, though never confirmed, that he kept books there too, small and private and, for the first time in his life, entirely honest. Josiah Fairweather's name was cleared in every parish record it had ever been written into, and a small stone was raised over his grave that read, at his daughter's own instruction, simply, "Ink does not lie." It was nearly a year later, at the next harvest ball held at Hollamere Court, that Gareth Ashdown rose before the assembled county and lifted his voice, and it did not shake, because it never had, and he said, "My friends, allow me to present the future of this house." And this time he turned and took his wife's hand and led her into the center of the floor himself, while 200 guests applauded a duchess they had once been asked to forget, and outside the tall windows, though nothing in the frosty dark could be seen but starlight on old stone, the wrens of Hollamere had already begun, faint and absurdly loud for such small birds, their winter singing. If this story warmed you, if some part of you recognized the particular ache of being the one nobody troubled to look at twice until the day the whole room finally had to, then come sit a while longer by this fire with me. There's a chair kept for you here, a kettle always near the boil, and I would love nothing more than to hear, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest. Whether it was "Ink does not lie" or "A woman who is never looked at learns to look at everything else," because I read every one of them. And they are the truest kind of company a storyteller can ask for. Stay close, keep your place by the hearth, subscribe if you'd like it kept warm for the next one, and until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the quiet ones in your own life. They are very often singing louder than anyone has yet troubled to notice.